The planet Delvoria had seen better days. Once a thriving world with lush forests and sparkling rivers, it now lay on the edge of destruction. For centuries, the alien empire known as the Zorvans had been a constant threat to the Delvorian people. The war had drained them, their resources were almost depleted, and their once proud cities were in ruins. Only one stronghold remained, a last refuge, but even that was being slowly suffocated by the Zorvans' unrelenting siege. Lyra stood at the edge of a great cliff, looking out over the battlefield below. The ground trembled beneath her as the sound of explosions echoed in the distance. The sky was dark with the smoke of burning cities, and the ground was littered with debris from the relentless assault. Despite their best efforts, the Delvorians had been pushed back time and time again. It felt as if there was no hope left. Lyra wasn't just any Delvorian. She was a warrior, one of the fiercest in her clan. Her people trusted her to lead them in times of battle, and she had done so without hesitation. Yet today, for the first time in her life, she couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was already lost. The Zorvans were too strong. The odds were too great. She turned from the cliff and walked quickly toward the command center, where the last remaining forces were gathered. The room was dimly lit, and the air was thick with tension. Officers and soldiers worked furiously at their stations, trying to coordinate defenses and make sense of the chaotic situation. But even as they worked, the unease in the room was palpable. It felt like a last stand, the last chance for the Delvorians to survive. "Lyra," a voice called out from behind her. She turned to see Eric, one of the older commanders, approaching her. His face was worn with the exhaustion of the war, but there was still a fire in his eyes. "The Zorvans are preparing another offensive. We'll need to retreat to the caves if we can't stop them." Lyra clenched her fists. She hated the idea of retreating. She hated the thought of running away from a fight they had been forced into so many times. "We can't give up. We can't let them win." Eric's expression softened. "I know, but sometimes survival is the only victory we can achieve." Lyra didn't respond. She couldn't afford to let her emotions get in the way now. They had already lost so much. She glanced around the command center, knowing in her heart that the Delvorians might not be able to hold their ground much longer. They were outnumbered and outgunned, and even the most skilled fighters among them couldn't hold back an entire empire forever. Suddenly, the alarm in the command center went off, a loud, shrill sound that made everyone freeze in their tracks. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just any drill. This was the real thing. The Zorvans had launched another attack. "Prepare for battle," she ordered, her voice steady despite the fear rising in her chest. She pulled her blade from its sheath and headed toward the door. Eric followed her, his face grim. They ran down the hall, through the corridors, and out into the open. The sky was filled with the unmistakable roar of alien ships overhead. The Zorvans were here, and they had come in full force. Lyra's eyes scanned the sky, searching for any signs of hope. That's when she saw it. A streak of light cut through the sky, brighter than any of the Zorvans' ships. It was a ship, but not just any ship. This was something entirely different. The energy it emitted was unmistakable, human. The ship's design was old, clearly not built for this war, but still powerful. It seemed to glow with a strange blue light, and for a moment Lyra thought she was imagining things. She was not. The ship came down hard, crashing into the ground just outside the city's perimeter. A massive explosion followed, shaking the earth beneath them. Lyra's first thought was that it was another Zorvan ship, some kind of last-ditch attack. But when the smoke cleared, something unexpected emerged from the wreckage. A man, a human man. Lyra couldn't believe her eyes. She had heard stories of humans, their incredible strength, their fierce battles, their legendary status. But they were nothing more than myths now. Their empire had fallen long ago, their civilization lost to time. And yet here stood a human, alive, standing tall amidst the wreckage of his ship, as though he had just walked off a battlefield. The man looked at Lyra with calm, blue eyes that seemed to have seen a lifetime of suffering. His face was weathered, and his clothing was that of a soldier, a relic of a long-gone war. His armor was scratched and dented, but it still gleamed with a strange, almost supernatural light. He stepped forward, and for a moment the world seemed to freeze. Lyra could feel the weight of his presence, a presence that seemed to command respect. He was a man who had seen things, done things, and lived to tell the tale. But there was something else in his eyes. A deep sorrow, as if he carried the weight of 1,000 battles on his shoulders. "I'm Commander Orion Cade," the man said, his voice deep and steady, "and I've come to help." Lyra stood frozen for a moment, unsure how to react. Could it really be? Could this be the same human hero that the old legends spoke of? The one who had once fought alongside the Delvorians against the Zorvans in a war that had ended centuries ago? The one who had vanished after the battle, leaving only stories behind? She took a step forward, trying to process what she was seeing. You're the one from the stories, aren't you?" she asked, her voice trembling. Orion nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "I've been gone a long time, but I'm here now." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. It was as if the world itself had shifted with his arrival. The Delvorians had been fighting for so long, with no end in sight. But now, with this man standing before them, something had changed. There was a glimmer of hope, just the smallest spark that perhaps, just perhaps, they could still win. "We can use your help," Lyra said, her voice firming as she stepped closer. "We need you." Orion didn't respond immediately. He simply looked around at the ruins of the city, the smoke rising in the distance, and the people gathered around him. His face softened, and for a moment he seemed to be lost in thought. Then, with a slow exhale, he nodded. "I'm here for more than just battle," he said quietly. "I'm here to save your people." Lyra watched him closely, her mind racing with questions. Who was this man? How could he have survived for so long? What was it that drove him to come back now after all these years? And why had he returned to a planet that had nearly been forgotten by the rest of the galaxy? But there was no time for answers. The Zorvans were already on the move, and if they didn't act quickly, the last stronghold of the Delvorians would fall. "Then let's get to work," Lyra said, a newfound determination in her voice. She turned toward the command center, Orion falling into step beside her. Together they would fight, together they would stand against the empire that sought to destroy everything they held dear. But as Lyra looked into Orion's eyes, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this man than just a soldier. There was a history, a past he wasn't ready to share yet, but that would come later. Right now they had a war to win. The battle raged on for hours, and still the Zorvans came. Their ships filled the sky like an endless swarm, blotting out the sun. The human warship, once a gleaming symbol of hope, was now hidden in the shadows of the Zorvan forces. Despite Orion's arrival, the Delvorians had little time to prepare. Their enemies were relentless, and as the day wore on, their situation grew increasingly dire. Lyra stood at the command center, eyes fixed on the holomap in front of her. She could see the Zorvan fleet moving into position, ready to strike again. But something had changed. The moment Orion had arrived, the mood among the soldiers had shifted. They fought harder, faster, as if his presence had ignited something within them. The very air around them seemed to hum with a renewed sense of purpose. Beside her, Eric, the older commander, studied the map with a furrowed brow. "Their next wave is coming from the east. If we don't reinforce that flank, we'll lose the high ground." Lyra nodded, but she didn't look away from the map. "We'll need to move our forces fast, get the reserve troops ready for a counterattack." "And what about the human?" Eric asked, his tone wary. "Are we really going to trust him with our people? We don't even know if he's who he says he is." Lyra glanced at Orion, who was standing at the far side of the room, his back straight and his eyes focused on the screens in front of him. He hadn't said much since arriving, but the calm confidence he exuded was impossible to ignore. There was no doubt in Lyra's mind that Orion was more than just a soldier. He was something else, a force of nature, a leader, and perhaps more importantly, someone who had seen war firsthand and lived to tell the tale. "He's the reason we're still standing," she said quietly, her voice firm. "And he's the reason we have a chance to win." Eric hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I hope you're right." Orion had only revealed little about his past, and even that was shrouded in mystery. He hadn't spoken much about the war he had fought in, the one where he had apparently saved her people, and Lyra had not pressed him for details. She had learned that sometimes it was better to let the past stay where it belonged. But there was something about Orion that felt both familiar and strange, something in the way he carried himself, as though he was still haunted by something long forgotten. The sudden burst of static on the comms interrupted her thoughts. "Commander Lyra, we have incoming," one of the officers called out. "The Zorvans are pushing through the eastern perimeter. We need reinforcements now." Lyra snapped into action. "Gather the troops," she ordered. "We'll hit them hard and fast, no time to wait." Orion moved swiftly, his footsteps echoing through the room as he joined the others in preparing for the counteroffensive. Lyra couldn't help but notice the ease with which he moved, his every action precise and controlled. It was as if he had been born to lead in moments like this, his every decision calculated with military precision. "I'll lead the charge," Orion said, his voice low but commanding. Lyra turned to face him, her eyes narrowing. "I'll be leading the charge," she replied. "This is my people's fight." Orion's gaze met hers, his expression unreadable. For a moment the tension between them thickened, but then he gave a small nod, a sign of respect. "Then let's fight together," he said, his voice unwavering. The soldiers were ready. Their weapons were charged, their armor secured, and their hearts steeled for the battle ahead. Lyra led them out of the command center and toward the front lines, Orion by her side. As they reached the battlefield, the sight that awaited them was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The Zorvans had already begun their assault, their ships circling above like vultures. Their weapons blazed, sending waves of fire into the city's defenses. But Lyra and her troops were ready. She raised her hand, signaling the charge. The soldiers surged forward, weapons drawn, and a roar of defiance rose from their ranks. Lyra led them, her mind focused, her heart pumping with adrenaline. She could feel the weight of her people's hopes on her shoulders. But this time, there was something more, something in Orion's presence that made her feel like they had a real chance to win. The battle was fierce. Blasts of energy filled the air, and the ground shook as Zorvan soldiers clashed with Delvorians. Lyra fought with everything she had, her blade cutting through alien armor with precision. Her movements were swift, her attacks unrelenting. She was a warrior trained to fight and survive. But even with all her skills, she couldn't help but feel that the battle was slipping away from them. That's when she saw it, Orion standing at the front, his warship firing directly into the heart of the Zorvan fleet. He was calm, unshaken, as if the chaos around him didn't even faze him. His commands were clear, and his soldiers followed without hesitation. Lyra could see why he had once been a hero. The man knew how to lead, how to inspire, but there was something more to it. Something deeper. It was as if Orion had seen a lifetime of battles, each one more devastating than the last. As the hours passed, Lyra couldn't help but notice how the weight of those battles seemed to rest on him. He carried them like an invisible burden, and it was clear that even his unshakable calm couldn't hide the scars of his past. The tide of battle began to turn. The Delvorians, inspired by Orion's leadership, pushed forward with renewed strength. They fought like they had never fought before. The Zorvans, taken aback by the sudden surge of resistance, faltered for just a moment. That was all the Delvorians needed. Lyra fought beside Orion, her heart racing as she struck down Zorvan after Zorvan. They were unstoppable, a force united in their desperation. The war was far from over, but for the first time in years, Lyra felt something she hadn't dared to feel in so long: hope. As the battle raged on, she caught a glimpse of Orion again. He was standing tall, his face expressionless, his eyes scanning the battlefield. It was then that she realized something. Orion wasn't just leading them, he was fighting for something more. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she knew there was something behind his eyes. A history, a story he wasn't ready to share. After what felt like an eternity, the battle began to shift in their favor. The Zorvans, seeing the tide turning, began to retreat. The Delvorians, exhausted but triumphant, pressed on, pushing the enemy back. Lyra's heart swelled with pride. They had done it. They had held their ground. As the last Zorvan ship disappeared into the horizon, Lyra lowered her blade. The battlefield was quiet now, save for the sounds of the survivors tending to their wounded. She looked around at her people, their faces filled with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. They had done it. Against all odds, they had fought and won. Orion approached her, his face still calm, but his eyes carrying a depth of emotion that Lyra couldn't quite read. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need, they both knew what this victory meant. "You led them well," Orion said, his voice steady. Lyra met his gaze. "We led them well," she corrected. Orion nodded, his eyes softening. "Together," he said, as if it were a promise. As they stood there, side by side, Lyra felt a strange bond between them. She didn't know much about Orion's past, but she knew one thing for sure. This man, this human, had earned his place among her people. And perhaps, just perhaps, he had found something worth fighting for again. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and blood. The battle had ended, but the war was far from over. The once dreaded Zorvans had been driven back, their forces retreating into the far reaches of the galaxy, but they would return. Lyra knew that. The fight was not won, not yet. But as she stood amidst the battlefield, looking out at the horizon, something inside her stirred. The Delvorians had won today. They had held their ground, and they had done it together with the help of the human who had come from nowhere. Orion Cade, the man who had appeared from the shadows of history, had led them through the darkest of times and had given them hope. Lyra's eyes scanned the faces of her people as they moved through the wreckage, tending to the wounded, preparing for the next assault. There was weariness in their expressions, but also something more, something new. It was hope. For the first time in years, she saw the spark of defiance in their eyes. They had a chance to rebuild. They had a chance to survive. But as Lyra moved through the camp, checking on the injured and offering words of encouragement, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Orion had been their leader during the battle, but there was something about him that seemed off. He had fought with them, fought for them, but he had also remained distant in a way that made Lyra uneasy. She found him standing alone, looking out over the ruins of the battlefield. His posture was straight, his face unreadable. He had a habit of standing like that, as though the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. Lyra had seen it in his eyes before, the sadness, the longing. It was as if the battle had brought him no peace, no relief. "Orion," she called softly, stepping toward him. He didn't turn to face her immediately, but she could see his shoulders tense as she approached. When he finally did look at her, his eyes were as distant as ever. "Lyra," he said quietly, "you did well, your people did well." She nodded, but she could sense the hesitation in his voice. He was hiding something. She had felt it from the moment he had arrived, and the more she saw of him, the more she understood that he wasn't just a hero. He was someone carrying a burden, one far heavier than the Delvorians' struggle. "You've been quiet," Lyra said, her voice gentle. "What's on your mind?" Orion's gaze shifted away from her, focusing on the distant horizon. "I've seen too much," he said, his voice low. "Too many battles, too many lives lost. I thought I could leave it all behind, but the past doesn't let you go so easily." Lyra took a step closer, her heart aching for him. "You don't have to carry it alone," she said softly. For a long moment, Orion didn't respond. Then with a slow exhale, he spoke again. "I wasn't always a soldier," he said quietly. "I wasn't always a hero." Lyra frowned, not fully understanding. "What do you mean?" Orion's gaze drifted to the ground, as if searching for the right words. "I used to be something else," he said, his voice distant. "Before I became a soldier, before I fought in the wars, I was a gladiator." Lyra's breath caught in her throat. A gladiator. The word felt strange coming from his lips. She had heard rumors, stories from the old days about human gladiators, fighters who had fought for sport, for entertainment. But she had never thought of Orion in that way. He was a hero, a leader, a man who had come to save them. But now she saw him differently. She saw the weight of his past, the guilt that clung to him like a shadow. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked quietly. "Why didn't you share this with us?" Orion shook his head. "Because I couldn't. I thought if I told you, you'd see me as nothing more than the fighter I used to be. I thought you'd see me as the man who killed for sport, the man who was nothing but a tool of violence." Lyra reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "But you're not that man anymore, Orion. You've changed, you're here fighting for us, that's who you are now." Orion didn't respond immediately. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, Lyra saw the truth of his pain. The past haunted him, yes, but it was also the reason he fought so fiercely for them. He wasn't just fighting for their survival, he was fighting for redemption. "I never wanted to be a hero," Orion continued, his voice raw. "I never asked for it, but when the war came, when everything was at stake, I did what I had to do. I didn't stop fighting because if I did, everything I had done, everything I had been would have meant nothing." Lyra squeezed his arm gently. "You saved us, Orion. You gave us a chance. That's what matters now." For a moment, Orion stood silently, his eyes locked with hers. Then he nodded slowly. "Maybe you're right," he said, his voice softer than it had been before. "Maybe it's time to stop running from who I was and start living for who I am." Lyra smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She knew it wasn't easy for him, and she knew the road to healing would be long. But in that moment, she saw a man who had finally found his way home, not just to her people, but to himself. "We'll rebuild," she said, her voice firm. "Together." Orion's lips curled into a faint smile. "Together." As the days passed, the Delvorians began to rebuild. The war was not over, and the Zorvans would return, but they had proven something. They had proven that they were not weak. They had proven that, no matter the odds, they could stand together and fight for their future. Lyra worked alongside her people, helping to strengthen their defenses, ensuring that they would be ready for the next battle. But she never lost sight of Orion. He was there working beside them, his leadership unwavering. He had become one of them, not just because he had fought for them, but because he had chosen to stay to help them build something new. They never spoke much of the past. Orion's story, his time as a gladiator, was something he kept to himself. But there was no need for words anymore. The past was behind them and the future lay ahead. And as Lyra watched Orion, her heart filled with pride. Not just for the hero who had saved them, but for the man who had found a way to redeem himself, to become something greater than he had ever been. One evening, as the sun set over the ruins of the battlefield, Lyra and Orion stood side by side, looking out over the land they had fought to protect. "It's going to be different now," Lyra said softly. "We've made it through the worst of it." Orion nodded. "Yes," he said, his voice steady, "but we can never forget what it took to get here. We have to be ready for whatever comes next." Lyra turned to face him, her eyes meeting his with a new understanding. "We will be." Orion's gaze softened, and for the first time, Lyra saw not just the hero, but the man he had become. A man who had once been broken but had found his way back. A man who had saved a people, not just from the Zorvans, but from the ghosts of his own past. Together, they would face whatever the future held. And together, they would continue the fight, not just for survival, but for the hope of a better tomorrow.